Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as ever, Dave Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Really happy to be talking about the middle of the country tonight, as we do on Left Reckoning here with Austin Ahlman. Austin is a reporter and researcher with the Open Markets Institute Center for Journalism and Liberty. And also, he did this piece we're talking about tonight, In Search of the Trump Osborne Voters in the American Prospect. Austin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, guys. It's a real pleasure.
So, Austin, we've talked Dan Osborne a number of times here, but for folks who are just catching up because the election is around the corner, who's Dan Osborne? What's he running for?
So Dan Osborne is he is an independent mechanic who is running the probably most unabashedly populist campaign, and for better or for worse, in the country right now, and probably in the last couple of cycles. So he's in Nebraska. Nebraska is a weird state with some quirks that are kind of friendly to an independent. And the reason everybody has been paying so much attention to it, obviously, is because the control of the Senate is on the line in this race. But then also it would have spillover implications all across the Midwest, where Democrats have just been getting their asses beat forever. And there's a new model for somebody who potentially can break free from that branding, it looks like, to kind of reach escape velocity.
And so how is he running? Because I've seen a little bit of anxiety from a maybe standard partisan Democrat on certain issues. Maybe we can get into some of those more in depth. But from what I can tell, a union working class guy going against the Republican is good news. Even if he did a full Kristen Sinema or something like that, and that's still not a Republican. Right? I don't know, talk about this.
Well, no, I mean, so that's part of the thing, right? Is no matter how you slice it on any issue, the guy's an upgrade. Even if it's a modest upgrade, you can argue about some of the, particulars. There's really no place in his platform, and especially in the rhetoric he uses on the trail, even if you are worried about some of the commercials, that's one thing. But the rhetoric that he's using on the trail and the actual issue positions he's staked out are all, frankly, better than your average milquetoast Democrat. Or on the issues where he's made concessions, it's the standard swing state Democrat line on a lot of these things. And so there's been a lot of anxiety, is a good word to use, around him. But I think a lot of it's misplaced, and a lot of it is kind of overcorrection based off of vibes versus the actual things that he's been saying, especially on the stump.
The main thing is immigration, as far as I've seen so far. And I just think it's wild that, Kamala Harris is running a campaign where she is granting and reifying all the premises of the right wing on the border, and you expect a guy like that to not buy into that sort of wind and any phrase. If he was a socialist, I would have a bigger problem with it. He's running as an independent working class guy, and I think just tell us what he said on immigration. He's basically said he did an ad where he basically said the Washington has got in the way of Trump, and if you want someone to help build the wall, I got some tools here for you.
Well, I think the best way to understand his immigration position is to understand what he wasn't saying 6 months ago versus what he's been saying in the closing weeks of the campaign, right? So in the early stretches of the campaign, you could tell this was an issue that he was comfortable moderating his image on. It was not central to his messaging. He was much more leaning into all the, populist economic stuff, supporting labor unions, et cetera. The turning point was when he started getting hammered on immigration. A lot of this is reactive, not proactive. I don't think that it's correct to say that he's running to crack down on immigration. I think that he understands this is his biggest vulnerability, because Nebraska, we're a lot of great things, but I don't think that we're particularly, progressive minded when it comes to immigration. I'll be quite frank. And so one of the big things that he's been hammered on is some of his comments opposing mass deportations, saying that that's unfeasible, et cetera, things like that. And so reactive to that, especially as the money has poured in these last few weeks, you have seen some ads that are certainly not ads I would ever approve of if I was on the campaign with him, but saying things to the effect of, we can definitely build a border wall, my opponent has failed to secure the border, things like that. And the thing that he usually points to is the standard Democratic line, frankly, which is Republicans sank this border bill, which is a bill that I have feelings about, but they probably don't match the general electorate in Nebraska, if I'm being quite honest.
Well, and I'm sorry, I have to throw in here too that remembering the national context. I mean, in the way that Dan Osborne gets sort of times oh, we're gonna, he's gonna be the next Joe Manchin if he gets elected. I'm sorry, like when we have here in Texas, Colin Allred, who like is very much like running on being the next Joe Manchin, on being the most conservative Democrat to get elected, it's just like, it's a kind of hard for me to listen to that kind of complaint about Dan Osborne, because whatever you want to say about some of that messaging, it's not out of line actually with a lot of the moves that we're seeing across the Democratic parties, elected officials and candidates for office in this cycle.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, my understanding is that he's intimated he's against mass deportations, supports, and he's been a little iffy on wanting to talk about it a lot lately, but supports a pathway to citizenship, talks about things like improving the asylum process, streamlining things like that. Like, the issue positions themselves, I think, are not really the problem. And if you take issue with it, you do, like you just said, have to take issue with the broader party and how they are talking about these things. He's just modulating his rhetoric to match a different audience, and that's the important thing to realize here.
Well, I was just saying, like, we're talking a little bit about the attacks against him, and we can get more into those in a minute. But like, I want to talk about why it is that, like, you're finding this race interesting, why we've been finding this race interesting. Matt, I don't know if you remember this, but back in the day, and Austin, if you could give us a little bit of his bio, but for people who've been listening to Left Reckoning over the years, y'all will remember that during the Kellogg strike, Matt, we were on YouTube live with Osborne when they were doing the picket line there back in the day, right? We weren't like interfacing directly, but he was like wandering around with his webcam, and we were talking to folks. Like, that is a very interesting political trajectory for a candidate for major office in this country, where there's not that many working class people, running for office. So, Austin, could you tell us a little bit about, like, his background, that is kind of makes him unique here?
Yeah, I mean, so he likes to say on the campaign trail, he likes to go on about how I think the figure is 2% or only 2% of our elected officials are from the working class, and how he would be the first one really in a long time in the Senate, especially because the Senate being much more elitist than the House. And he makes it quite clear that he wants to like start a movement based off these things. He wants other working class people to be able to do these things. And he points to his background as a union worker at the Kellogg's factory for years and years and years. Currently, he works at Boys Town. He was fired from Kellogg's for reasons that you can decide if you think are valid. I guess we all kind of have our opinion on that one, right? Born and raised in Omaha, never really left the state except for to serve in the military. Has interesting things to say about his military experience and how he views things like the defense budget because of it. He's just he is, to his core, if you were going to like create in a lab the perfect populist candidate to just like cut through noise and make people believe that he wants to do things to like get rid of corruption and things like that. He's that guy, His tattoo sleeves down his arms. He likes to talk about how he doesn't own a suit. I mean, he lives and breathes, like, I am the working man.
Well, I mean, just out of curiosity, Austin, I mean, you've gone around Nebraska, you're from Nebraska. Could you talk about like how that has been kind of resonating with folks, and also, just throw in another comparison. I will say I do have those alarm bells ringing when I hear it's like, oh, I don't wear a suit, I wear something different. I do think about John Fetterman. Can you make any comparisons between the two of them on that front? But also, more importantly, like, how is this resonating with people in Nebraska?
I think it's resonating a lot. So I hate to lean on family because that's always a suspicious in a thing. But I come from a family of Republicans, a lot of people that are working class, even working for Trump voters. And they all just seem to love the guy. I have never been at a family event where every member of my family was voting the same way. And I can say that changed for the very first time when I was home. And everybody was like, yeah, I'm voting for Osborne. Of course I'm voting for Dan Osborne. Who else would I be voting for except for Dan Osborne? And when you ask them, that they like vibes about some of the policies, like, oh yeah, he talks about corruption, whatever. But when you get right down to it, it's kind of like I quote my uncle saying in the piece, and I was really trying to drill down, like, what do you really like about this guy? Plain and simple answer is, he's a working guy, and that hit, especially in the smaller and mid-sized towns. As you get out further west, you get sort of a more rancher mentality. It's not quite the same culturally. But in central Nebraska, it seemed like he was catching fire in all of the places that you would need to catch fire to get over 50%. And it's with those types of voters, just the everyday people who don't have college degrees, working in, trades that are blue collar for sure. And that's where he seems like he's running up margins, or at least cutting into margins that no Democrat, I think, ever could.
I want to talk a little bit about that sort of outreach and the Trump Osborne vote. I mean, maybe actually before I do that, Deb Fischer, where's the sentiment at with her?
Not good. So part of it, I think you have to attribute to Dan Osborne's campaign. They've done a hell of a job of driving down her favorable rating. You know, they had a message about her, which is that she is lazy, that she is bought and sold by corporate interests, and they have just hammered it for a year. And you can see, if you put a chart of her approval rating up, she just over the last year or so, and is now pretty healthily underwater. That said, she made herself vulnerable in some key ways. So in the piece, I talk about spending a day out in her home county, which is Cherry County. This is the Sand Hills. This is ranch land. And I'm just trying to look for any sign of enthusiasm whatsoever from the people that who knew her best. So this would be where she served on the school board, her former seat in the state unicameral, all in this area. She won it by like 70, 80% of the vote multiple times. And I just could not for the life of me find a single Deb Fischer yard sign. And I thought that was pretty weird because it's not like they don't put yard signs out on ranches. And in fact, they put the biggest yard signs you've ever seen. I saw dozens of state legislature race yard signs, and I just could not find any signs of enthusiasm. I interviewed, I think, 8 people total. I mentioned 3 specifically in the piece, but not anybody, not even the ones that defended her, would say anything kind about how she shows up across the state, about how accessible she is, about how in touch they are with the things that she's doing in office. And then even, The Hill, I think, had a piece a couple days ago, or maybe it was last week sometime by this point, where even the other Republican senators were kind of just mad that she had made herself so vulnerable by not showing up and just doing basic constituent work, which is not, frankly, that hard to do in a state as small as Nebraska. If you're in a state as small as Nebraska and your constituents don't know who you are, like, you have a big problem.
And has Dan Osborne done the empty chair stunt? Because I know she's refused to debate him. Could you talk about that a little bit?
He has. So he's a very kinky campaigner in some ways that I think is kind of adorable and I know works. Like I know how people are. You can do those little stunts and they work every time. He has done the empty chair dozens of times. And I really don't know at this point what the strategy is from her part. She's not even doing real public events that are like held with notice. Reporters are finding her inaccessible. I did my darndest to just show up at an event where she was speaking, and I just could not get enough lead time to get where she was. But by the time I would find out that she's doing a public event that had maybe 20 people there, it was hours away, and there's just no way to get there in time. And then the series of appearances that I think she's done over the last week are all at county GOP events. So not really open to the public or meaningfully interfacing with the public. She is just really, really closed herself in there. And I honestly don't understand the strategy behind it at this point, because it has made what shouldn't be a race into a race, her actions as much as his actions and his message.
Yeah. I mean, so like, how would you describe, the campaign that he's running? Is it similar to, like, sorry to be Texas focused, but like, is it similar to like a Beto O'Rourke thing where he's like going to lots of places that maybe a non-Republican wouldn't, go typically? I mean, what's the kind of on the ground strategy? And also, how are organizations like, unions in the state sort of reacting to the campaign?
So he has a lot of support from unions. Unions have been spending on his campaign. Union members, including Republicans, have been essential to his messaging across the campaign, featured them in ads. But in general, I mean, he's running the campaign of his life. The guy is everywhere. It was not hard for me, in stark comparison to Deb Fischer, to find events where he was at any given day of the week. And he's opening campaign offices everywhere. It's not like he's just huddled down in Omaha and Lincoln. My hometown of Norfolk, which is about 25,000, a good couple hours away from any metro area. He opened a campaign office last week. He made sure to time it like when we do our downtown trick-or-treating, where all the kids from all the surrounding communities come and they go to all the businesses and they hand out candy. He made sure to open his campaign office that evening so that he could hand out candy while all the news cameras were around and everybody from the whole surrounding community was around to see him and, ham-fist it with him and all that stuff. He's just running a very smart, tactical campaign when it comes to just eking out those margins in all those places that Deb Fischer, I guess, would never dream of going.
What policies is he really hammering Fischer on? Is it corruption generally? What are the things?
It's corruption. The big one is that she is bought and sold by big ag. And that really hits in Nebraska. There's this huge, beef around, corporate farming and then small family farms are disappearing. Which one has power monetarily? Which one has public support? There's a huge disconnect between that. And especially when you map that onto our members of Congress. And he's wielded that to very deadly effect. But he's also thrown, defense contractor stuff, those contributions in there. The really big thing with her is that he says that she's bought and sold. He's found a few other things around the edges, but he is honed in on the fact that she's taken so much corporate money and that he never will, never has, never would, et cetera.
Our friends at I just on the messaging really quick, our friends at the Center for Working Class Politics, and Jacobin, Matt Karp, have been very focused on this campaign because in a lot of ways it's sort of, proving or at least testing one of their theses, is that hey, if liberals and Democrats might start writing and talking about politics a little bit differently and messaging differently, you can actually win in places that are quote unquote red states. I'm curious, how you would describe not just the policies, but the way that he kind of presents himself and speaks about these kind of issues. That is, I don't know, that is different from maybe another kind of union aligned Democrat in another state.
There's a lot more fire behind it. Number one, I think that you can just tell that he means it, which is the tangible difference that you get from an actual union leader versus just a politician that's been close with unions. I think that he also connects it to a broader theory about the economy in a way that's more effective. He talks a lot about systemic corruption. He talks a lot about corruption in Congress, the contributions of big corporations, the lack of power of unions in a very cohesive way, right? The system is rigged. You might have seen some of it that's been going around, things that's been highlighted from the stump speech, is he tells the Mouseland allegory, the Tommy Douglas story of old about a bunch of mice being ruled by cats, and they keep voting for different types of cats, hoping whatever. And he delivers the punchline very clearly that we need to stop electing goddamn cats. And that is the difference, right? It is in a way identity politics, right? We don't have to shy away from what it is. He is a working guy, clearly is not talking about this in hypotheticals. And that just comes through in all of the different ways that he connects the issues together in his stump speech. And then when he's doing Q&As and things like that.
You'll have to apologize. I have to apologize in case my attention has seemed a little bit drawn away. I'm in a fight with a Free Beacon writer about Dan Osborne now. Dan Osborne, Phil Litsu, who is Josh Hawley, a former Josh Hawley guy. Now he's the National Republican Senate Counsel. Dan Osborne claims he's a lifelong independent who will fight Trump. In reality, Osborne was registered Dem his entire life, said Trump. Lost him for good in 2016. Attacked Trump as embarrassing and incompetent as recently as this year. And I'll just say, before I let you fact check some of that, the thing about Trump being embarrassing, most Trump voters admit that. They'll just say, yeah, I know his tweets. He does the tweets too much, but it's the other stuff. Who cares that he called them embarrassing? But that lifelong Democrat thing, what's your take on that, Austin?
It's fake news. No, so it is 100% fake. But the way this started, and don't quote me word for word because I don't know the exact phrasing that was used, but a few mainstream outlets, I think that it was Bloomberg and I think also the Times, misquoted him when he said something to the effect of being turned off from Democrats in 2016 to say that he was registered as a Democrat, which is just totally false. Voter registrations are public in Nebraska. This is something that I had multiple people point out to me while I was reporting, including my aunt, who loved to do the famous "do your effing research" line with this, which is that the guy has been a registered independent his whole life. He has never run on the Democratic line. He, as far as I know, has never really had active affiliations with Democrats in any meaningful way. Has very successfully worked with Republicans in office, which in Nebraska, that's a feat. If you're a union leader who can work with Republicans to get them to support your strike, well, I'll be damned. And so it is just very wrong. There's nothing to it, but it has been hammered and hammered. And the way that these mailers work is the fact that it was reported and then not corrected for all that time means that the mailers are fair game. They're not going to run afoul of anything with the FEC. That has been the line over and over again. He is a registered Democrat, that he was a Democrat, that he's a Democrat in sheep's clothing. And there's really nothing to it. You can tell, at least I think I can tell where he lines up more neatly on issue positions. But the guy is not a Democrat. And I think in ways that matter, which is cultural cues, his willingness to talk about the Democratic Party in negative ways and name faults, you can tell that he hasn't spent a life building those relationships and favor arrangements. He just hasn't done any of that. It doesn't stick to him very easily.
And for any of those anxious Democrats who may be tuning into this, I would just say the fact that the National Republican Senate Council comms director is taking his time to attack Osborne is probably a good sign that he's not just going to become some sort of MAGA independent in Lincoln after beating Deb Fischer.
No, I think that there's a great chance that he defies expectations as far as who he ends up caucusing with. But I do think I would be shocked if he did anything even half as destructive as Joe Manchin. I think that insofar as he has leverage, he would wield it in novel ways, I think, maybe not neatly like caucusing or other things like that. But he's already said what he wants to do with his first priorities. Like if he was going to negotiate for parties, he said that he would negotiate for the PRO Act, that would be the thing that he would... that you could probably get his vote for important stuff like floor control if you promise to pass the PRO Act. Like it's just not the same. A union
he doesn't have a bunch of coal interests in West Virginia.
Right. Yeah.
He isn't doing massive dirty deals about actual dirty products.
Well, no, yeah. There's been this insane discourse about why is the left okay with this? Why do progressives seem to have this soft spot for Dan Osborne? I was like, well, why the hell do you think that we like the union leader more than the coal baron? Like, it's not that hard to figure out. You don't have to like skip to the most insane explanations. You can really just start with the simplest one.
And even like Cinema, who was sort of the academic, she wrote a book on necropolitics and was a Green Party person. Even her, like, I will say Osborne, out of the pick of those, comes from the background that I'm most comfortable with. And that's just you know, I guess we'll see how it stands. I hope he wins so that we can find out, because I think just everybody, what we should all agree on is ready to say goodbye to Deb Fischer.
Yeah. Well, on that, I mean, Austin, I don't want to put you in the position of having to make a hard prediction here, but I'm going to ask you one: are we going to look dumb next week, or how are we feeling about how this might look?
Well, I don't know. I just had to write my take on this race, and the thing about writing is that it's even worse than saying it on a podcast. And I stuck it as a concept. In my gut, I think that I felt at the time that he had an advantage. I don't know how I feel now. I don't think that anybody's going to look dumb, because I don't think that if he loses, it's going to be by a lot. I think it would be single digits. It's still going to be the best performance statewide by anybody that doesn't have a Republican next to their name. And I think it's very safe to say that he does a better job and overperforms way more than like the Greg Ormans or the Al Grosses of years past, these other independent type candidates. So I think we could look a lot cooler than we otherwise would next week if he pulls it out. But I really don't think that there's a disaster scenario where we have to go back to the drawing board. I think a lot of this is baked in, and it's proven by the fact that he's just to the very finish line overperforming.
Well, Austin Ahlman, we'll link to the piece in the Prospect, or the American Prospect, in the show notes. Anywhere else people should follow you?
I'm on Twitter. Otherwise, do subscribe to the Open Markets Institute. If you like labor populism, if you like anti-corporate politics, we're a great organization for you.
Thanks a bunch, Austin.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.